Igor Girkin is not very optimistic about Russia's future in Ukraine. Now, Girkin's got a bit of a checkered past, to put it lightly. He was involved in leading separatist militias in Ukraine back in 2014, shot down a civilian airliner. And since the full-scale invasion kicked off in 2022, he's been more of a mill blogger, kind of providing analysis and commentary on the war over Telegram. Now, Girkin has been an interesting individual to follow because he is very much pro-Russia. He wants Russia to succeed in Ukraine, but he does not think they're doing it the right way. He does not think they're going far enough or providing the right resources or carrying out the best strategy to be successful. So we do have to keep in mind when viewing anything from Girkin that his assessments tend to be pretty negative of Russia, which means that a lot of people that want Ukraine to succeed in this war will take what Girkin has to say and be like, it's great, exactly what I want to hear. So you got to balance it a little bit, right? It's a guy that wants Russia to succeed, but is also pretty critical of Russia. So take it as you will. And real quick, worth noting that Girkin was arrested a few months ago for some of his commentary. And this letter was supposedly something he was able to pass to his wife that published on his Telegram channel. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Girkin says, the situation at the front at the moment is at a strategic impasse. Ukraine cannot return the lost territories. The Russian Federation is not able to clear the territories of the DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions from the armed forces of Ukraine. I think stalemate sometimes gives people the impression that there's no fighting at all. That's certainly not the case. The fighting has, in a sense, slowed a little bit over the last couple weeks, really. Anytime there's not a major offensive operation of one side or the other pushing battalions or more into the fight, you're going to see a slight decrease, but the fires have remained steady. The drone warfare has remained steady. It's still very much a lethal fight all across the front, but it's interesting to see, from inside of Russia, a Russian source here, to say that it's essentially a stalemate. And now he's talking about the here and now, but he is going to get a little bit into what this could mean going forward. He continues saying the armed forces of the Russian Federation will continue their strategic defense, having the only task to prevent deep breakthroughs or sensitive operational successes of the enemy. And you can understand that, especially earlier this summer when Ukraine was massing forces and with all their new Western equipment to try to break through the Russian lines and race to the Sea of Azov. You'd understand it then. The idea that a strategic defense now and into the future is Russia's plan is interesting. You don't tend to see a lot of people in Russian media talk about that being the goal. That's kind of accepting the fact that this is going to be a very drawn-out war and raises the question of how is Russia not able to go on the offensive? If Ukraine is as battered as Russia says, if there's so little of the Ukrainian military remaining as Russia says, why are they committing to a long-term defensive posture? Girkin continues saying the United States is more than satisfied with the continuation of a sluggish war without the preponderance of any parties. It is this position that explains the significant reduction in the amount of assistance to Ukraine and the extreme slowness with the delivery of already promised weapons. I've mentioned this before as a possible very cold-hearted take of what's going on in Ukraine, and it's the idea that the longer that Russia is actively engaged in fighting in Ukraine and they have to hold these positions and they're trying to attrit the Ukrainian forces, look, it ties up the Russian military, right? It's chewing through their resources, chewing through manpower. They're not going to be able to effectively or as effectively as otherwise project power anywhere else around the world. How much of a threat is Russia to NATO in a conventional military sense if they're still defending in Zaporozhye and the Donbass? It kind of limits what they can do. And there's another concern here as well that Girkin kind of hits on. He says, I assume that a major military success of Ukraine for the United States now seems unnecessary and maybe even dangerous because it can provoke the Kremlin to increase the degree of confrontation. It's another way of saying escalation. And in previous videos, I've talked about that a little bit, where there's all these different areas, the push and pull of where escalation could happen. And one of the concerns over the last, I'd say 6 months, since this Ukrainian offensive in the south was kind of picking up steam and eventually kicked off, was if the Russian military were to collapse or there was a significant breakthrough, then what? That's not something that Russia's likely ready for, prepared for, to, at this point in the war, all of a sudden be on the defensive and retreating across some of these occupied territories. So it's not a crazy thought to say if the lines are somewhat stagnant, it reduces the possibility of escalation. He continues kind of suggesting what that U.S. policy might be. He says, let's give him, Putin, the impression that we are close to surrender in Ukraine and tired of the war. When the time comes, we can easily increase supplies in a matter of weeks, whereas the Russians will need many months of preparation for a full-scale offensive. I can understand how he came to this conclusion. I don't think it's accurate, but I can understand how he gets there. If you look at the media across the United States and a handful of NATO countries at this point, but I'm mostly dialed into the media here in the U.S., it's been a hot topic recently, right? Ukraine aid was just removed from the bill to keep the government funded for an additional 45 days. It's more of a conversation, more of a debate here in the United States than it's been since the start of the war. For an outside observer, I 100% understand how you could look at this and say, it looks like they're getting tired. It looks like they don't have the stomach to see this through for another 18, 36, 72 months, whatever that might be. But the idea that all of this is being done is some sort of long-term trap, I think just might be a bridge too far. Can't really get on board with that one. But continuing on, he gets into his conclusions. He says the Kremlin has completely lost the foreign policy initiative and is, quote, waiting for the weather by the sea. What he's getting at is that it looks like inside of Russia, they're essentially waiting to see how things play out with the United States and NATO. One of those being our coming presidential election. So his point is Russia is no longer calling the shots in Ukraine. They're having to wait to see how other nations are going to proceed. And then, Putin will make a decision. Do they continue to attack? Do they go on the defensive? Do they try something else? He continues saying, for the coming months, probably for the autumn-winter campaign, I predict positional battles without significant changes in this strategic situation. Separate operations are possible on both sides for propaganda purposes. That's not a crazy prediction. I mean, realistically, if we look at the last 6 months or so in the war, I understand that Russia has made some gains in the northeast. Ukraine has liberated some territory in the south and the east. But if you really step back, those changes in territorial control has not changed the overall strategic situation in the war. I think it's possible that there have been some shifts that's tied to, in my opinion, the attritional nature of the fight. But now we're getting into losses of men and equipment and how each side is able to replace those and continue the fight. And we don't know those numbers, right? Both Ukraine and Russia have done a pretty effective job of keeping their losses under wraps. If one side or the other was dealing with significantly more casualties, then the last 6 months could have changed the strategic situation in the war. It's just not, very obvious on the surface. And then the second part where he says that separate operations are possible on both sides for propaganda purposes, that's nothing new. We've seen that throughout this war, whether the fighting is dying down in certain areas or even intense in others. These type of spectacular attacks or deep strikes or raids or whatever it might be is a way to draw in media attention and kind of keep the war front and center for a domestic or international audience for either side. Really, right? We have to be careful to not take those events, small-scale events that are intended to just kind of show progress in one way or another and interpret that as something bigger than it is. It's easy to fall in that trap. Overall, I think Girkin does a pretty good job of explaining the reality on the ground, and I think it's a pretty fair assessment of what we might see coming up. Now, in terms of what that means for Russia, he says, the bloody push-pull, which as the main danger I warned since the fall of 2014, has become our uncontested reality. In the conditions, if a miracle does not happen, it will almost inevitably lead Russia to catastrophe and disintegration. Now, I think there's probably going to be a lot of people that key in on that part. Pro-Russian commentator says that Russia's going to disintegrate if they don't change. I would imagine that's probably a little bit in the extreme. Doesn't seem to me that Russia is on the verge of breaking apart. They don't appear to be on the verge of collapsing, Putin being ousted, anything like that. I would imagine that Girkin has to get some of this stuff in there to try to draw attention to it, right? You're not going to change if the outcome is minor, but if the possible outcome of not changing is the disintegration of your nation, maybe somebody takes this a little more seriously. But that's all I got for now. If you're interested in national security topics, be sure to check out the sit reps I put out on Substack once a week. It's 7 to 10 of the top national security stories along with podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.